Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Seeking the Hidden Thing podcast. It is my distinct pleasure to have on again Jay Burden. Welcome, Jay.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kryptos. It's great to be back.
Well, as this often happens when, so some behind the scenes, inside baseball stuff. Most of us who do podcasts that kind of get to a certain level of notoriety, we all kind of know each other and we're in regular contact with each other all the time. So I'm in fairly regular communication with Jay, and you don't really think about it, but the last time you had me on was in April. And the last time I actually had, it was April. That's it. It's like April. Wow. And the last time I had you on my show was November of last year.
Jeez, I like legitimately.
It doesn't seem that long, right?
Because when's the last time you talked to Kryptos? I'd have been like, I don't know, maybe 3-4 weeks, like 6 weeks.
Yeah, like 2 weeks ago. Yeah, we were talking about fishing, and so.
Well, that's the problem. There are multiple people who exist on the internet I almost never have on my show because I talk to them on the phone. And that in my brain is like, well, why would I have a podcast? I've already had the conversation. And so you and I will go back and forth about, not like every week, but like fairly often. And so I think that you're 100% right that it feels as if we're in much more regular contact than we actually are from like the outside looking in.
I think our last conversation was showing fishing pictures, and then I showed you the picture of my 19-year-old daughter's monster largemouth bass, and then you showed me the pictures of your sad little crappie. I think they were crappies, right?
I think so.
But yeah, what? I'm just like.
Speaking of that, actually, I'll send it to you afterwards. I've got a crazy video. Not to get into this. This is inside baseball, and I'm revealing too much on air. You know this. My father is quite an accomplished angler. He sent me a video that is somehow even more bonkers than anything else he has. Not of him. He is not catching a fish, but there is just general wildlife shenanigans going on. For those wondering, this is what Kryptos and I send each other. It is mostly fishing outdoors, a commiseration about how badly the current day of fishing is going.
And then every once in a while, we'll have some random conversation and about something or another where you need to bounce something off me or I need to bounce something off you. But that's generally how it goes.
It's mostly
this is how we got to today's topic, because like preparation of preparations, this is another thing. There are podcasters who spend hours and hours prepping. And I will actually, if I have Athenian on, I will prepare, because it's only respectful that for the level of preparation he puts in, that I should be at least a 10th prepared as he is. Just out of respect. But you and I think for the most part, just wing it. I think the favorite is, hey, why don't you come on? I'll think of a topic and I'll let you know when we go live. And I'm sure, I'm game.
Occasionally people like ask me like, oh, what is your, how do you brainstorm a topic? And I joke that I'm from the Bill O'Reilly School of Broadcast Journalism, which is we'll do it live. There's a personality aspect to that, but also I initially very, very early, like sub 10 episodes of my show, I would prepare obsessively and write out outlines and notes. And it was very, very robotic and weird. And that works for some people. It does not work for me. And so maybe I have erred too much on the other side. But it makes for a more natural. That's really what it is. I'm a podcasting naturist. It may mean something else, but we'll go with it.
Well, you also do interview shows. So one of the things that, and this is a testament to what you've done, is that you have a knack for asking good questions that get people talking. And that is not, it's not everybody can do that. I'm maybe not as good at it as I could be. Which is why I try not to host interview shows. I generally try to have conversations, because I'm much better when somebody is talking of then thinking up a whole bunch of stuff to say. And then when it's my turn to talk, spending 5 to 10 minutes saying it and then bouncing the ball back to the other person who talks for 5 to 10 or 15 minutes. And we kind of go back and forth like that. And that format sort of works for me, because I got some early complaints on my show that like, well, you're not letting the guests talk enough. And I'm like, well, first of all, I'm not interviewing them. We're having a conversation. So I feel perfect. And it's my show. So if I want to talk, I can talk. But so now I explain to people that, this is a conversation show and not an interview show.
This is an interesting distinction that you're making. I will also say, just as any sort of creative, and obviously being a podcaster is sort of the Dalit of the creative world, right? The untouchables. But there you need to have, and I say this both as a joke and also genuinely, you need to have a certain distance from your audience, because you see this oftentimes on the internet, that people get in this kind of parasocial Ouroboros where they're constantly looking for the affirmation of people in their audience. And obviously there are some cases in which having an audience to bounce things off of is useful. So for instance, I was messing around with some buttons in my editing software and made the episode sound horrible. And so when I get a bunch of emails that say this episode sounds horrible, it's like, oh, okay, don't do that again. Right. But there is a degree in which if you were initially recognized for your unvarnished opinion or creativity, it is easy to lose that by being overly receptive to an audience and overly responsive to the demands of people, particularly when there is money involved. And I say this as someone who makes money from podcasting, but it is important to understand that, like, well, you should definitely pay attention to feedback in like a grosser aggregate sense, this was obviously especially negative feedback. But that said, it's also your thing. And if it becomes responsive or reactive in that way, it sort of loses what could have made it special to begin with. Maybe this is too chin stroking, but I think that particularly with the incentives of social media, which is to turn everything into a mass product, to turn everything into the most maximally appealing form, it sort of creates an incentive to sort of ruin what was special about a creative endeavor. Sorry, Cryptos. That's probably really off topic of what we're talking about.
Well, actually, no, it probably isn't off topic, because I think what, this is the thing is I said, well, okay, because you and I think, 2-3 weeks ago, we said, hey, we should do a podcast. And then I said, hey, I'll come on your show. And you said, no, you should have me on your show, because I haven't done that in a while. And it turns out it really hasn't been a while. And then I thought for a couple of weeks, what am I going to have Jay to come on and talk about? And I thought, well, Jay spends a lot of time talking with people. And I thought, why don't I have you on to kind of talk about the state of the discourse? And I left this sort of as wide open as possible, whether it's the discourse in terms of like what is happening on Twitter and Substack, what is happening in the broader social and political landscape. But there are things, I think many of us who do this have noticed that things have been changing. Like my thoughts to what you were saying there is, when I first got onto Twitter, I spent a lot of time on the timeline, and that's just because what you did. And, I've, done a lot of reading, been reminded myself of things like Jacques Ellul's comment that, the being in touch with the news is the best way to allow yourself to be propagandized, because you just kind of float in the temporary present of today's stories. And so it might surprise people, for somebody who is as online as I am, that I spend very little time paying attention to the actual timeline. Most of the things that I post about come from either group chats or things that I'm reading. I do spend a little more time on Substack notes a little bit, only because the pace there is slower. And usually I'm scrolling through to find good articles, not so much good posts. And so I'll see what other people are reading, and then I kind of read that, and then I'll comment on that. But as you say, it's very easy to tailor your content to the audience, and you can do it now algorithmically. And this is sort of the advent of slop, is, since computer driven, and people used to do it beforehand, but it would be done more intuitively, where you would tailor your content for a specific audience. You're doing a cooking show, a running show, a cleaning show, a decluttering show. You're using some sort of like lifestyle type show, or you're specifically speaking to a certain interest group, and you're thinking. I've always been a thing where I'm a fairly independent thinker, and I don't pay too much attention to the news, so I have no idea a lot of times what's going on. But I have a good sense. I think it's just kind of a weird dichotomy, even for somebody who doesn't pay attention. I have a good sense of sort of what's actually going on and what needs to be heard. And I've always had a sort of predilection for saying it. And so that's what I tend to do. So I just tend to say the things I think need to be said. And it turns out that, 6,000 plus people on Substack agree. And a few of them have even decided to pay for the privilege. So it's wonderful that way. But I don't really tailor my stuff to an audience for the most part. But I mean, it's very hard not to do something and have an audience and then get sucked into interacting with your audience. It's kind of a weird sort of thing. So anyways, with that as sort of in the background, let's maybe turn it over and I'll let you just sort of frame how you think, and then we can go from there. I have a couple of random thoughts about the sort of the state of the discourse, but where do you see things right now, Jay? Because I think my sense of it is that things have changed, like two significant events. One is the long-term effects of Elon Musk owning Twitter. And then the other thing that has significantly changed is that Donald Trump actually got himself elected. And that, I believe, has significantly changed the shape and nature of the discourse, especially on the right. Anyways, I'll just leave it up to you. And if you completely disagree or want to take it in another direction, just go right ahead.
Yeah. So first off, there are kind of two, I think, different levels of discourse. There is like broader cultural discourse. We could consider that like left, right, like the biggest possible sense. I think that discourse is well and truly dead. I wrote a piece, it appeared on the Old Glory Club called Kirk Shot Discourse Killed, talking about exactly this. Because effectively, that sort of discourse, which is not nearly the kind of polemic, right, yelling at your opponents, but at least going through the motions of engaging in some sort of national debate, functioned on a premise that this was a good faith debate. There was something to be gained by engaging in that activity. You could, as the sign in the meme goes, change someone's mind. Well, the problem is, and look, this is, I assume, been discussed on your show. If not, it's been reams have been used to discuss it. Well, Charlie Kirk, the discourse guy, he got shot. And okay, fair enough. Maybe he just got shot by a crazy guy. That happens, right? Salman Rushdie got stabbed, and that didn't really change the course of culture forever. But I think the really disturbing thing was the reaction. It was the celebration, either tacit or explicit. Now, look, I get it. Big, like top line Democrats like the Obamas said, hey, we, disavow political violence of all stripes, as they no doubt should. But you don't have to get very far down to get to people saying, yeah, he kind of deserved it. Yeah, he was a fascist. I mean, look, you have, I can think of off the top of my head, half a dozen U.S. representatives, right? Which, okay, look, like a congressman isn't the most important person in the world, but that indicates that at least at a certain level of power and certainly below it, that is an acceptable idea to express. So I think that has had a massive, and I guess the term I use this on Boyce is we could say like apocalyptic, not in the sense of like the end of the world, but like a revealing, right? Revelation, making something known. That this is true for a long time, right? Discourse had been dead for years, but for many people, particularly conservatives, who I think were perhaps the last people who believed in it, it was made very clear that that doesn't matter anymore, that there is no real utility in debating progressives. They simply do not care. It's actually we had talked about this in our episode on the true nature of the culture war, the sense of having a disagreement and then not having the mechanism to resolve that disagreement. So if you don't have a mechanism to resolve that disagreement, how are you ever going to talk about it? Well, certainly. And if the conclusion is, well, if you disagree vociferously enough, you are basically prescribed for execution. Or even not literally, well, if you are executed by one of our foot soldiers, then, well, that's no skin off my back. The understandable conclusion is, well, why are we talking? clearly this has become a existential struggle. And look, man, the lion and the gazelle are not parsing terms. That's not really what's going on there.
Yeah.
So I think that sort of discourse is well and truly dead. I don't see anyone engaging with it. It was even sort of an anachronism when the squishy center liberals were doing this one election cycle ago, right? The sort of IDW types, when they were engaged in this, it seemed past its sell-by date. But it seems as if no one really believes in it anymore. I mean, this is why you and I have spoken about is the kind of like secular state religion of the American empire a number of times. And we also spoke about the way in which that religion is losing its faith, or is losing its kind of force, that God is dead, not, capital G, but
no.
God is dead.
The one that animates the state in that regard. Yeah.
And I think that is a very interesting way in which, like, the many of the kind of pillars of the post-war consensus, which is, a roughly synonymous term, are crumbling. That the things that were previously sacred are no longer so. So that's the international, or the national level, rather. As far as like intramural, right, like the stuff that happens on the right wing, it's gotten a lot worse. Maybe not worse. There are perverse incentives now for a number of reasons. One, the financialization of discourse that we've seen through Musk and others, particularly engagement, has really motivated a lot of poor behavior, because all of a sudden it's, I am literally paid by saying something to provoke a reaction. Rage baiting always has existed, but this has sent it into overdrive. I mean, you even have, as the right is in a relative cultural ascendancy, right? People are interested in our ideas. You see a pipeline from, our friends to the biggest podcast in the world, depending on how you measure it. I mean, look, man, like, I know personally 4 or 5 people who've been on Tucker in the last 365 days, right? Like, to say that, like, there is comparatively, this does not mean that we rule the world by any means, but comparatively more attention on our circles, which creates a incentive to grift, right? More so than if it's just something completely irrelevant. Then you combine the fact that, especially on Twitter, which I spend very little time on, largely due to these changes, of course, that's going to decrease the quality of discourse. So really, I think that discourse is dead on the national scale. Politics is not, obviously. Politics is still happening. Within our own circle, it also seems that not only is it in a diminished capacity, but things have become, I feel like they've as there has been relative mainstreaming, there's been sort of a stratification between who I would broadly constitute as serious and not. And when I say serious and not, I don't mean to say respectable, far from it, but to say that I think it is clear, and you've seen this in relatively increased relevance, that relatively increased relevance that is a horrible phrase. I'm sorry, it's a crime against grammar and style. But point is, it seems as if many people were on the right for one of several reasons. One, it was a way to be transgressive for its own sake, just to endlessly violate taboos. You still see that around. That is obviously poison to discourse, because it is not real critique. It is simply critique or violating a taboo in order to be shocking. So that obviously kills any sort of meaningful discourse. I think another one is a desire to be, the biggest fish in a small pond, right? The desire to accrue sort of clout in a walled garden, and a fierce desire to keep that garden small, walled, and completely irrelevant. Because look, like, if you are winning in discourse, if your ideas are more successful, more people will know about them. Look, I'm not a liberal. I don't believe in the free market ideas, but there is a very real sense in which, winning begets more winning. There's nothing as successful as success. And so, look, again, when I say this, I'm speaking in relative terms, not in absolute terms. But I think discourse on the right is not in a very good spot. And not to bring this back to my own work product, it's something I sort of aim to not fix, but to sort of serve as a bridge between different kind of chapters of the right. because there's not a lot of productive discourse between them. The pattern seems to be provocative statement made, chimp out between two sides occurs, nothing is resolved, a great deal of Elon bucks are spread around, rinse and repeat, ad nauseum. So yeah, that's sort of my opinions on it. I'll throw it back to you, Kryptos.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you've said there. It's I think you even see the deadness of the discourse. And partly one of the things that brought us together was trying to effect a shift in the discourse in a more Christian direction, right? Because, excuse me, there was all of these, in back in the early days before Musk and that there was the right-wing discourse. It wasn't even necessarily right-wing. It was just more people complaining about the system and the way it was, and people trying to understand why things are the way they are. Why is everything so bad when we're supposed to be living in the greatest time in history, kind of thing? And if you're an American or in the West, like, we live in the best places in the world. Why is everything going to hell in a handbasket? And why is the regime so awful? And people tried to understand things like power and how it works. And then also tried to blow past a lot of the commonplaces in the public discourse, the civil rights discourse, and then, actually having a real conversation about race and some of these kinds of things, that nobody actually wants to have. So you have the NRX groups, you have the IDW groups, the international or internet dark web kind of thing, and or intellectual dark web. That's it. And then, so you get all of these different kind of groups, and then there's just guys, like you look at like Oren just reading books and talking about them, but they're books on political theory and why power is the way that it is, these types of things. And then you get guys over on, on the other side of the ocean, like AA and stuff, and he's doing like real academic research into these subjects to understand them. And so you've got this wild and woolly sort of thing. And as the discourse has kind of filtered itself out in some ways, but we as a group sort of said, hey, we think that ultimately this contest is going to boil down into, what is seen as like the secular state and the secular society versus those who cling to the Christian faith for a number of reasons in a number of various levels, right? Whether as scapegoating for the failures of progress. And so it's worth the effort to shift the discourse in a decidedly Christian manner. And being part of that effort early on, in many ways it's succeeded, but even that discourse in many ways is dead now. Like, does anyone even care about Christian nationalism anymore? Like, even the left is not exercised about it the way that they used to be. It's kind of bizarre that way. And I think in many ways, since Trump has gotten elected, like even strange things have happened to the Christian right that have been kind of surprising and troubling. So one of the things that I've done in response to it is, in some sense, to withdraw, and maybe like you do, to say, like, ask, why am I here? What am I doing? And realizing that I have certain things I think that I can provide insight on and that I can teach people. And, many of them are spiritual in relationship to politics, and help people to see things that they don't want to see. Now, in today's discourse, that means in some ways pointing out things that people don't want to see about the Trump administration. And that, I think, in some ways is maybe where the block is in the discourse, is that when it was the left that owned the regime, it was very easy to be critical because you knew who your enemies were. But today, when Trump's in ascendancy, you're basically supposed to be a team player. We voted for that. This is what I wanted to see happen. And, are you tired with the winning yet? And nobody wants to hear some old crank like me come out and tell them, well, I kind of maybe hope it works, but here's why it's not going to work. And I'm just going to, save you the trouble. And, or is he really succeeding in the way that we're succeeding? Like very early on, I got in trouble with Charles because I said, it looks like Trump's primary purpose is to throw red meat to his own base and then govern based off of the propaganda that he's generating from throwing red meat to his base. And Charles took kind of exception to that. But, so it's sort of one of these things, I think, that what is the role of online right-wing media? Is it to critique? Because I think all of the structures of power are the same with the same effects, but it's just now our guys are in charge. And so this is like, I've used the Marshall McLuhan. If you're watching wholesome programming or you're watching porn, you're still watching TV. And I suppose, is the Trump administration wholesome programming? Probably on balance, it might be better than what we would have gotten on another channel, but we're still watching TV. The regime system is still in place, and and so you get the sense now where the right has, instead of looking to be post-liberal and post-Western like they were even a year ago, now the project of the right is in shoring up and making the regime successful, the regime system. All the structures of power are still there. Now the online right has become about how do we make these structures of power successful and work for us as everyday Americans, which is a very different discourse than was happening like a year ago. Does that make sense? I know I'm kind of I'm probably thinking aloud out here, maybe just even using you as a springboard, but these are some of the things that I have been kind of thinking through and never really had a chance to really fully talk about with anybody, which is part of why we're having this conversation.
Look, I think that I think what you're probably reacting to a certain degree is an element of pragmatism, which is like, look, speaking as an American, I live here. And
yes.
So I have philosophical concerns and also like basic governance concerns, which is like, I've said this before, right? That I think that there are two categories of issues facing the West and facing America. You have management issues, which is like, hey, we decided to make crime illegal and let meth heads build tent cities. And it's like, okay, well, that's fixable. We should probably fix that as someone who lives in an area where that could be a problem, right? Like,
and I agree fully in one, because we have the same problems here.
Right. And so it's like, okay, that's part of it. Then you have the kind of like the genuine spiritual problems, which I do not see as someone who has been honestly relatively positive about what we have actually gotten from Trump. I don't see him addressing the deeper spiritual issues. I don't even know if those can be addressed. But that's, maybe a discussion for another time. As regards to that shift, I think part of it is pragmatic because one, we do live here. And two, having another crack at it was not at all, I guess, required. Like, it was a very real possibility that we just lived in like the 10,000 year labor reich. I mean, I'm being slightly facetious, but like, given the data point that was 2020, where the election, the freest and fairest election in history, allegedly was just dictated, right? It seemed as if, okay, like, how do you react to a political system where you not even where you have no say, even in a nominal sense? Okay, fair enough. I think also part of what you're seeing with the Trump administration is that they're more so because Trump is a populist. And also, let's acknowledge, we have, because of that increased relevance I mentioned earlier, and the fact that, look, like, we have friends in high places, have more say than previous. The Orrin McIntyre leading the always chimp movement. Like, okay, sure, it isn't a 1-to-1 correlation, but assuming you live here, even if you are the most hardened reactionary in the world, if you've got like, let's just say like 100-sided dice and like the 100 gives you what you want, you're like, I'll throw it. It's like, why not? It seems to do something. And so I think it's important to understand that, like, just because that works now, even in a small way, doesn't mean that is, one, the ultimate endpoint of your movement, or two, something you do forever. But like, if you're used to getting nothing and now you have let's just go with round numbers, 1% chance of getting what you want, it's like, all right, like, hey, that's something. It's again on the level of the kind of management issues that we're kind of plagued by. So I think that's part of it. Also, I do think that there is, and I'm going to speak very vaguely on air, but I will provide the receipts to Kryptos on this later. The right went through sort of a phase of elite theory. It's still around. I mean, it's a relevant way to examine politics. Obviously, it's still a basis of my political analysis. And there are sort of two ways to look at that, which is either you can become the elite yourself or capture their attention. The project of becoming the elite has not gone super well. Admittedly, I would argue it hasn't really been given enough time to develop. But there is a faction within the elite that is at least interested in what we have to say. I can confirm that shows in our orbit are regularly listened to by very rich and powerful people. They think it is worth their time.
Yeah.
And so, okay, you can look at that and say, maybe we're just X% more entertaining. I kind of doubt that because the numbers are in the grand scheme of things relatively small, but there seems to be some sort of explanatory power there, right? There seems to be an information advantage, something that is worth someone's very valuable time. I mean, calculate the hourly rate on a billionaire, right? What an hour of their time is worth. And they have decided that, something from our guys is worth that. It is, okay, fair enough. Maybe this is just their guilty pleasure. And I believe that for one. But when it's a handful, half a dozen guys, you're like, okay, this kind of defies belief that they just happen to be interested in this random thing and it affects their life in no other way. Right? Like if we were talking about like building model ships, I could believe that, but this is a little more specific, a little more edgy. So I think that if we're talking about, well, what is the point of the internet? Right. Well, that's one. Like, okay, there seems to be some sort of counter elite movement. And I'm not trying to say that they're my best friends. I agree with everything they want. They're pulling in the right direction even, but that's a chink in the armor. Because remember, it was relatively recent history seemed as if the regime in and of itself was a monolith, right? It was simply moving in lockstep. I mean, you remember, and maybe this was a bit kind of schizo, but the whole Build Back Better stuff, where it felt like every government on earth was doing the same thing and saying the same thing, kind of locked arm in arm. And it's like, okay, well, that's sort of fallen apart. Maybe there's a Tower of Babel comparison to be made, but also even like within the U.S. government, USG, well, there's been a split. There's something interesting. And, as Lenin said, it's like, well, when you find mush, push in the bayonet. And look, man, I'm not saying that like tomorrow we get everything we want, but it's like, look, man, if you've been frozen out basically forever, I think you can forgive people for saying like, all right, man, like, let's give it a shot. Again, do I think that regenerates the West? Do I think that fixes that spiritual malaise? No, probably not. But one, we've got a very limited deck of cards here. You and I don't have a lot of different options. And okay, given what cards we do have, I feel like we owe it to at least, to our posterity, our culture, whatever, to give it a shot, right? Like if you have a chance, it's like, well, go for it. And is there a real chance that doesn't work? 100%. Is there a real chance that we're being taken for a ride? 100%. But like realistically, what position does that put us in otherwise? Like, okay, we don't have power. We didn't have power before.
And
sorry,
and you're absolutely right. And this is always the thing too, right? And I have it's always the struggle between being the pessimist and then as I've talked before to others, the whole thing of the tank problem, right? So you live in a world where you have to grapple with the tank problem, and it expresses itself and manifests itself in multiple ways. And you're right. So like I've said before, I said, you may think that, building machines and having assembly lines and high technology are evil. And you and your society, your community are going to decide, well, we're not going to build tanks. We're not going to build assembly lines. We're not going to build high technology. But you're a large enough community that, you've come under the notice of your neighbor, but your neighbor has no qualms with building tanks and assembly lines and machines and so forth. and is quite willing to run his tanks over you. So now you have a tank problem. So if you're going to deal with your neighbor and you're going to maintain your own sovereignty and your own way of life, you have a very, very hard choice to make. You may think that these assembly lines and tanks are evil, but you may have to, out of necessity, embrace them to a certain extent, or at least develop a means to stop them, which probably means going down many of the same routes as the machines necessary to build tanks. But whatever, you have to grapple with this tank problem. And so in many ways, as you say, the problem of, American administration, but global administration, we have the same problems in Canada as well too. England, France, Germany, the EU, all of these major power centers are experiencing many of the same problems. And so you have a group of politicians who are now in office and whose ear, like you say, even if in part you have their ear, why not try to use that to, in a sense, grapple with the tank problem? And you're probably not going to be able to do it successfully, and maybe you're going to have some success. And like, as you were saying, Jay, too, you're absolutely right that at a certain point in time, being right in the shadows is one thing, but at a certain point, you then have to step onto the main stage and deal with the exigencies of, running something and being in power. And those are the necessities of that will often cause you to have to compromise, the pure idyllic system that you're able to hold on to in the shadows. And so you're absolutely right there. So, maybe these changes are, in the right-wing discourse are or were inevitable given the Trump's ascension to power. And like I say, you and I, have many of the same acquaintances, and it's just wild to think that people that you're acquainted with are now being tapped, become like undersecretary of this or, assistant secretary of that. And you're like, this is just a bizarre world, that I could actually call up somebody on my quote unquote Rolodex who's now actually in the administration. It's just like mind blowing. So there is, and there aren't a lot of handbooks out there to like how to transition, like 10 winning steps for handling the transition from being a dissident to being in power and doing so successfully, that just doesn't really, those types of guides just don't really exist out there. I guess my concern is that there are guys who may potentially be losing their way to grasp at that ring that is now so agonizingly tempting. And that they've somehow forgotten. Like, I worry, and maybe just as is worrying for friends, that there's going to be a crash out if this thing doesn't work. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely something to be cautious with there. To your point about sort of needing to get your hands dirty, like, let's accept the premise that mass politics, if we can use that term, is the problem.
Yeah. Without a doubt.
Let's just use that as a stand-in, right?
And the problem is scale.
Yeah.
Scale and mass politics.
We live in a society at scale. So
we do.
Realistically, that is the terms on which everything is done. And so you're like, okay, well, where do we go from that? Well, either... Yeah,
this is the field of battle chosen for you. That's right.
And so it's like, well, look, like we can... this is kind of my feelings about the internet, to be honest. The internet is very, very bad for you, and yet here I am. But
there you go.
Okay, well, you have two options, which is either you can contend with the field of battle as it is, or simply wait for the conditions to change. And okay, sure, if your answer is to be a quietist, I guess, you can be. But one, why are you here talking to me? Like, not you, but I'm saying like the hypothetical interrogator. Like, if your point is to simply be a quietist and never talk to or interact with anything, it's like, well, I mean, you can do that. And look, I'm not saying that to be flippant at all, but like, we've got to understand that, like, if there is a certain degree to which success will require compromise, and actually you see this all the time with what I consider like the outer edge of the like intellectual right. The people always looking for, the next thinker, from Carlyle to Evola to to Gabanu, to, you know, whoever they're on to now. And is there something noble in kind of looking for, you know, the discarded gems of the Western tradition? 100%. Like, go for it. But there's this disdain they have to yesterday's thinker. You know, there's this disdain they have towards the hoi polloi who have only read Carlyle. They haven't gotten to Evola. Or if they've read Evola, don't they know Evola is so 2022? And I get it. You know, there is a desire to differentiate yourself. But the problem is, it's like, and this is an idea, I always say Moldbug said this. It might have been someone else, but I'm going to continue citing him, where he says, like, look, success is having your own idea explained back to you by the most retarded person you've ever met. Right?
Yeah.
And look, he's being flippant there, as he often is. But the problem is, it's like, look, we have to understand that winning in an ideological sense, not ideological, in the realm of like mimetic warfare means spreading. You are certainly engaging in ideas at scale, because that is, again, the ground on which we play. Whereas if we were living in a different world, it would be, you know, who read the pamphlet, or who wrote the pamphlet read in, you know, every salon across Europe. That would be your battlefield. That would be the scale at which, you know, the conflict of ideas was waged. But it isn't. And so either you can vacate the field or you can play. And to me, particularly as an American conservative, a Christian American conservative, I have seen where that sort of acquiescent attitude leads. I have seen where that, oh, well, I will simply retreat from culture leads. That is it's effectively you're acting as a free rider. You see this with like Anabaptist communities, right? The Amish, where effectively, and this is actually changing. The Amish have gotten much, much more political due to the excesses of woke culture. So I was going to say for any of our Amish listeners, but I guess by definition, they're probably not listening unless they're particularly bad Amish.
And if they are listening, what are you doing? You need to turn that off now. And
yeah. But no, in all seriousness, right? Like the idea of retreating and let others fight the battle for you. Actually, Quakers are even a better example in the context of settling the American continent. Like, look, my ancestors got here to basically function as protection for Quakers. They were, you know, bringing back to England. They were like, hey, send your craziest white boys over here to go fight Indians. And they're like, oh, great, awesome. We've got a bunch of these Scotch-Irish guys. Go cause chaos. That's what you're good at. But seriously, if you are interested in engaging in political warfare, which even the quietists of yesteryear, the pacifists of yesteryear, have determined that the stakes have risen to that point. And this goes back to the, you know, what we see with Kirk, that the consequences for losing have never been higher. Then it's like, okay, well, like, you got to play. So what we've accepted that you are going to play, the question becomes, well, where do you play? So you've decided that you were going to engage with, you know, mass mimetic warfare. Okay, well, you can engage at the top level. So like, you know, right versus left, broadest possible sense. That seems to me to be dead. There doesn't seem to be anyone really paying attention across. We still, I mean, even debates are not nearly what they used to be, but those seem to primarily exist as an exercise in kind of like mental masturbation. Okay, so let's knock that off the table, assuming I'm correct. Well, then it becomes, well, can you get your ideas in front of interesting, influential people? And that seems to be that, you know, a certain segment of the internet right is able to do that at a higher percentage than average, you know, at a lower barrier to entry, we'll say. And also you have your people more broadly, right? Conservatives, at least in my case. And there is a very fruitful war to be waged there. I mean, look, I as you probably know, Kryptos, love to go after the kind of gatekeepers of the conservative movement. You know, one Jim Lindsay, a few others, you know, they're always fun to go after.
How he has not blocked you yet is just beyond me.
Me too. I'll be honest, if I were him, I would have done it. Probably.
This is your one big character flaw, Jay, is that you, for whatever reason, you cannot get James Lindsay to block you on Twitter.
I think a bigger character flaw is that I haven't voluntarily stopped looking at this point. It's the, like, you know, when someone's like, hey, smell this, it smells super bad. Like, one, you shouldn't do that. And two, if you're sitting there 20 minutes later, you're like, yeah, oh yeah, that smells
I got to go back
horrible.
one more. Yeah, they say, no, yeah,
Yeah.
that really does smell bad.
At a certain point, it's on you. But there is something as well to be said for that, which is, okay, these are my people, the people I have a great deal of affection for, that I grew up with, and I see that they are being led astray. So that discourse of saying, well, is the kind of house conservative line, is that conducive to the flourishing of my people? Yes or no? Well, I think that's incredibly fruitful because, as we know, Richard Weaver tells us, ideas do have consequences. The things that you think affect your life, your output, right? So clearly, if you have care for a group of people, you should care what they think. You should care who they are giving their money to, especially if they're, basically throwing it before swine. And so, to me, and maybe this is just me saying what I am doing, that I think is the most right wing, and then right wing discourse, particularly attacking the conservative movement, is what is most productive. Those are both. That is a area where discourse is live. Things are changing. I mean, even look at the life of Charlie Kirk. He changed his mind on any number of things. Obviously, the things he was. I mean, he defended in explicitly racial terms that poor woman Irina who was stabbed to death shortly before his death. I mean, hours before, saying this is anti-white racism. That is a phrase that was, I'm completely and totally prescribed relatively recently. That was something only available on, the fringes of the right. And so, okay, we can see that conservatives are in dialogue with us, whether they want to or not. That is a winnable fight. And that is a fight that there is a reason to win. It is not simply for clout, but the people in their audience are good people I care for. So that, I think, is an area in which discourse does exist, where discourse is worth it. And is that perfectly ideologically pure? No. But one, ideology is fake. You were putting a perfect moral prism upon a messy human world. And the alternative is simply to not engage, which I think is a bad alternative. You got me a little fired up there, Cryptos. Hopefully I didn't... didn't
well, it's interesting that you talk about it. Like, yeah, it's interesting you say that too, because, like, as you say, I've done some, thinking about sort of where my place is in the discourse, and I think that's one of the things that I try to do. Is, I mean, yeah, like, okay, so if there are any consultants looking out there to, hire someone smart to tell them how to, develop policy and campaign programs and wedge issues and so forth, my DMs are open. But I'm fairly realistic. I shouldn't say I had a phase in my life where I was actually involved in electoral politics and helped get a number, in the Canadian context, 3-4 different MPs elected, and was actually a card-carrying member of the Conservative Party of Canada, and I donated enough money to the party to actually get one of their special little cards that they send out to their donor class. So it's not significant. Don't come crying to me. It's not significant amounts of money. That threshold is surprisingly low, believe it or not. But so, I have been involved in, back in the day when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, I met him a few times. But Canada's, again, it's a much smaller pool and it's a different sort of place. And, with our mutual friend, the Black Horse, we have been, one of the things that we've been working on doing in the Canadian discourse is to bring sort of a realistic politics, elite theory type of approach to Canadian politics, where a significant number of people are trying to do populism in Canada, which really doesn't work because of the difference in the nature of the system. And so they've adopted a lot of, they even call them like Maple MAGA. And so there's a lot of where, Canadian conservatives will style themselves after, American libertarianism, which is, it just sort of, and that tends to dominate many of the most active voices. So we've begun to try to speak to our own, in a sense, to seed as in SEED, seed ideas out into, the Canadian right-wing political discourse for, a better conversation, more to do, in some sense, to do the kind of things that Orrin McIntyre was doing years ago, but do it in the Canadian context within understanding the Canadian culture. And, that myself, and like I do a lot of religious and theological talk. So I myself tend to try to speak to others in our movement who I think can listen, and can benefit from that. And so I've been blessed to write for American Reformer and talk to Christians who are, many of the guys who read American Reformer are far more active in politics than I am and more influential. But the idea that some of those guys are picking up articles that I'm reading and then, going away and mulling them over is in a sense rewarding. And I have, as you've said, I've heard phrases and things that I've said in my podcast or in my writing spoken back to me on somebody else's podcast, which is it's an interesting experience. Or somebody DM me saying, we've got this private server over here and we're having quite the conversation about your recent piece. And I'm like, oh, okay. So that's the kind of thing, as I guess in the state of the discourse of like, kind of running the question of, and this is, I guess, for guys who are out there thinking about writing, or you're out there tweeting, in a sense of, in terms of status, who are you actually talking to? And I think that's a really good question to ask of like, who are you trying to persuade? Who are you talking to? Because sometimes it's not always clear what folks are trying to cheer. Like it's unfortunate that they're, being in a mass media, there's just a lot of guys who are on the internet who are themselves just sort of, they're embracing the next latest thing. And that's, you try not to do that if you can. And that's sort of my bit of practical advice. But I'm sort of wandering off. This is, I think, part of why this topic appealed to me, is because this is kind of where I'm at in the moment, sort of reflecting on where the current state of the discourse is and where my role is in this. But yeah, so that's, I think, kind of the thing is too, is so there are some people who have the ear of the regime, but then there's people who speak to those people. And, where are you at in the, and who are you trying to speak to? So that's and who are you trying to convince? I'm actually trying to convince people on my side who I think that's kind of the funny thing. I'm actually probably more often speaking to people who are on my own side, who I think might listen to me, than trying to speak with people who actually disagree with me.
Yeah. I mean, so there are several things there. One, I think that the other thing is that the Pareto principle reigns supreme, that there is a very, very wide base to the pyramid. And I've actually noticed this as someone who's in the past few months been much more active on Substack than I previously have been. So I used to use Substack exclusively to read articles from like 4 people. Like they could fit on the Mount Rushmore of Substack. And they were always great. And so it led me to believe, wow, Substack is this awesome app where only the best are. And when I spent more time there, I realized, oh no, this place is full of some of the dumbest things I've ever seen written in my entire life. And I shouldn't be surprised by that. I didn't necessarily think that in like an academic sense, but it was a realization. And so I think that as we're seeing something grow, and I do think that the right is growing. I mean, I could speak to that. I think it has the potential to grow even more because it has a certain amount of explanatory power that, shall we say, the current civic religion does not. You're going to understand that due to the incentives we outlined earlier, and also just simply due to the fact that the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, whatever you want to call it, reigns supreme, there will be a lot more dumb and bad actors. Just sort of what happens. Like it stinks, but there's only so many 130 IQ guys. And sure, if you add 1,000 people, maybe 10 of them are 130 IQ. And I don't even necessarily believe in IQ, but we'll use it as a rough metric for what we're talking about here. That's going to happen. And I don't love it. I don't love the fact that like, and I'm sure you've had the same thing, that like if you experience a big, influx of new people, you go on a show and people are like, oh, follow you. And then for the next couple of weeks, you're listening to, shall we say, uninformed, queries because it's people that are, more, I guess, kind of broader market. And then again, I don't mean to say that in like a moral judgment by any means, but to say like, that is sort of suffering from success in a way. That's sort of when something becomes massified, it by definition must dissipate at least a little bit. And so that question's like, well, are we a mass movement? I don't necessarily think so. I think that if we are to have success, it is perhaps as a vanguardist tendency. And so look, even in that, and you can look at the mid-century Germans or the Soviets and see that even in a vanguardist movement there is a mass element. And I am not at all asking for the right-wing version of the Bolshevik Revolution, far from it. But to say that that was very much a hardened core of revolutionaries. It was an elite, and yet there was a mass component to it. And so I think that simply that is the way of politics in modernity. It doesn't need to be forever. But in addition to understanding that there is both, we could consider it even in a religious sense, an exo and an esoteric version of an idea. There's a version that is easy to discuss in sort of a vanguard, but would be very difficult to disseminate to 100,000 to 1 million people. I think that there needs to be an understanding that there are also different roles, that not everyone can be the same sort of person. And I noticed this actually with the way that people on the quite radical right talk to sort of the farthest edge of like the acceptable conservative movement. So, for instance, you oftentimes hear complaints about, Daryl Cooper or Ann McIntyre, both of whom I quite like, saying, oh, why won't they say this? Or they're not far enough on this. And you've got to understand, regardless of what those guys think, I'm not going to speak for them, they can't say that and still do what they do. But they can, act as sort of the narrow end of the wedge, right? Going back to our, kind of quote from Lenin about, sticking the bayonet in. And I think that maybe a certain amount of grace with that is probably warranted as well. You see what I'm getting at, Kryptos?
Well, yeah. And this is the funny thing too, though, right? So, and you and I have observed this, that different media, like McLuhan was right. This sort of the medium is the message, right? You and I are both very, very different on Twitter than we are on our Substack or our podcasts. Podcast has a conversational thing. So sometimes, like conversations can just take a turn because they're sort of free flowing and random. And sometimes you can get caught up in conversation, say some things like, oh, maybe we shouldn't have said that. But when you're writing and you're doing long form writing, it's a very different sort of pace. And most of what I say when I do long form writing, because I'm, as a former pastor, I'm used to having to say things in a public sense. So the split between what I might think privately and what I would think, within the sense of having the responsibility of speaking from the pulpit where your words have to be orthodox and have to speak. So sometimes you have to be very measured, even if you're trying to shift how people think in a positive way. You're not trying to undermine, tradition or theology, but you're trying to speak in a positive way. That if you're trying to get people to think more seriously about things that may challenge some of their long-standing beliefs, you have to do so in a way that they will hear you, in a way that's careful. You can't just go up and like some posts on Twitter. And, once Elon Musk took over Twitter, where guys were like posting, the N-word 50 times in a row in posts just to do that. But at the same time, you and I have both noticed that, Twitter brings out our inner 15-year-old more often than it probably should. And that's so you have to just kind of be mindful of the fact that there is something about Twitter that just kind of engenders that sort of overly clever and quick repartee that is sometimes, it's not the kind of thing you would ever say in a polite company or in a long form sort of way. And then maybe one other thought is, it's interesting that you mentioned Substack in terms of like, I like when we first came on and it was like 4 or 5 really smart people. But one of the things that I hadn't at first paid attention to, because I came into Substack through the avenue of like somebody on the right encouraging me to do so, is that Substack is still like a predominantly, overwhelmingly left-wing medium. But the interesting thing about the interactions on Substack is because long-form writing lends itself to care and precision and thoughtfulness that the left finds a lot harder time critiquing and say getting you banned, because you're not doing the kind of juvenile things that you would do on Twitter, or where you're going after somebody to the point of just the point is to get them to block you, that type of thing. Whereas on Substack, you're looking to actually engage intellectually with people, and you occasionally will find that cross-fertilization where somebody from the right or somebody from a community that doesn't think the way you are finds your material, reads it, and has substantive criticisms to offer. And it's just like, because Substack has everything from like cooking moms to, advice to liberal politicians so it's just kind of, but it's all because it's all very, very long form. It lends itself to something that's much more careful. So I've noticed those cross-fertile in that regard. So yeah, that's kind of like sort of the two big sort of broad thoughts to sort of what you were saying there. I think that in terms of sort of the way that you interact and how you can interact, and even sort of the sense like, yeah, some of the guys on the right want you to just burn it all down. But if you're going to establish a thoughtful discourse, you have to be thoughtful about it.
No, certainly. And I think that, and it's difficult to say, because when you say the right needs to grow up, there are two ways to look at that, which is one, there is the way that is cynically been used to say, the right needs to be, the dissident right, the right, the new right needs to become the conservative movement. That's not my point at all. But to say that, like, and honestly, man, like, I enjoy a certain amount of online shenanigans, but I think there needs to be, one, a time and place, and also an understanding that, like, there's a certain benefit to that sort of, in-group signaling. There's a certain benefit to that sort of thumbing your nose at authority. But simple critique of the left, simple reaction to the left saying, I don't share your moral standards, isn't this funny, is only useful up to a point. And I think it's important to say, like, and I say this as someone who is a much more, not every episode, but on average, a much more comedic show than you do. Right? I'll do something much more lighthearted. But to say, like, I think there needs to be a sort of understanding of time and place. I mean, for instance, I just wrote an article, it's free, check it out if you want, talking about a lot of the internecine fighting I see among religious people on the right. Sort of using the premise of there was a shooting at an LDS church in Michigan, and actually the way I found out about it was someone quote tweeting an article about it saying Mormons aren't really Christians. And it's like, okay, well, that may or may not be true. I certainly, shall we say, have opinions on the matter, but one, not really the best time to hash this out, especially when you consider that, like, regardless of your opinions on, non-Trinitarians and if they are Christian or not, the people who hate you for being white, religious, straight, fecund, whatever, they hate them too for the exact same reasons, and they have not deigned to, carve out a distinction one way or another. And so I say that to kind of show that, like, look, like, there is a time and place to have that debate. That is a real difference. That is a real discourse, to go back to that word. But there is a season for all things, and in much the same way, I think the kind of like shenanigans, the online shit posting stuff, that can become all consuming in a way that I don't think is productive. But I mean, look, like, I'm not trying to say that that's never fun or never appropriate. It's just like there is a needed moderation. I guess, if that makes sense. How's that for a tepid conclusion?
Well, yeah, no, I have a thought, but just to sort of the ways that having fun and seriousness can and internecine fight. Like, you're right. The thing about that Mormon place of worship, church, I guess they call it, is that, as you say, the regime sees you as the same thing. So whether you're what, and this is the same thing too, like where you get a lot of the Orthodox and the Catholics and the Protestants fighting with each other, is the sense is know what time it is, because the regime sees you all as the same thing and would happily squash you all as Christians. So maybe the way to look at it is your internecine fighting is a luxury belief that was okay when Christendom strode the world omnipotent. But now when you're in a decided minority, vis-a-vis the secular world, maybe it's time to just recognize that, hey, yeah, we're different, but we're all serving Christ. Now, again, like you say, I have my thoughts about Mormonism, but at the same time, the regime sees us as the same. So there's a sense of like, and it's just unseemly to celebrate like, oh yeah, it's okay for them to burn down their church because they're Mormons and we don't think they're Christians. Like, and you're like, okay, dude, that's just like, I think if they were burning down Jehovah's Witnesses, which is obviously a cult, I think like, yeah, this is a bad thing, that really we shouldn't,
get that with like the Branch
and
Davidians.
Yeah. And there's even a sense, and people may not want to hear this, but if let's say it were to come down to the facts where like a terrorist group were burning down a synagogue or a mosque in North America or a Hindu temple, that those actions too, as much as I don't want those types of religious things like around, like I don't want mosques being built in Western countries. I don't want Hindu temples being built in Western countries. Synagogues, we can tolerate that, I guess, but like still burning those down. Like when leftist activists burn those down, these are not good things either. So, there's that to kind of take to mind, right? But so anyways, I was involved just this whole thing between serious posting, like Neil Shenvi took a screenshot of one of my tweets where I tweeted about the Longhouse, just to explain. I had a conversation with my wife and I realized like every day my wife is trying to Longhouse me, but it's just, and she's about as conservative as they come. And she's just doing it because she's a woman, not because she has any leftist predilections. It's just what women do. So I basically, spent the day in my mind tooling over how to phrase it, picked a picture of a Norse longhouse and threw it out on Twitter, and it got 250,000 views and like 2,500 likes. Crazy enough, right? So Neil Shenvi picks this up, blacks out my name and blacks out my avatar, and says, uses it as an example of the woke right. So one of my followers sees it, sends it my way. And so I called him out on it. Then he goes back and picks up an earlier tweet of mine the same day that I tweeted this very kind of thoughtful tweet about, the Longhouse in a kind of a loving way, just thinking about discourse with my wife and just being amused by it. It caught me a shit post, right? Where I said, somebody, one of these, I think she had like a 2 million account, female philosopher or whatever, said something just really brain dead, right? So I just did the classic shit post, woman opinion discarded, right? And threw that out on the timeline. So Neil Shenvi clips this because I guess Megan Bashan jumped in to sort of say, like, this is a perfectly acceptable post. So Neil Shenvi clipped that. He went into my feed, found that tweet, threw it up to say, like, now you're defending this kind of person. He's bad. And thankfully, Megan had the sense not to take the bait and just said, Neil, that's just a shit post. Actually, she called it an excrement post, which was herself. And then she said, I'm not even going to play that game. And I thought, oh, good for you, girl. You know what I mean? But it's one of these things where you can have these kind of dichotomies. And then that being said, all of that kind of sort of discourse, it comes back to also something that, again, our mutual Black Horse he wrote a piece a while back that was wildly successful, where he said, people, you have to take responsibility for the kind of things that you're saying online, especially if you pretend to be in a leadership position. So if you're calling young men to go out and protest and to do things that would get them the notice of, 3-letter agencies and security services and get their bank accounts frozen and get them thrown in jail, you had better be there to support them through this. Or you better think twice about the kind of things you're saying. You need to have take responsibility for the words that you put on a paper. And I think he's absolutely right. And so there is a sense where there's a certain level of juvenility is perfectly fine, but there's also this sense that we need to be responsible, and this is part of wanting to ascend into leadership positions, is that you have to be willing to don't call, like, if you can absorb the hit for this kind of action, many others can't. And so if you are willing to call for these sort of things, you have to be willing to support those who do go out and then follow your advice. And if you're calling for, say, hey, we should start blowing up abortion clinics, and then somebody goes out and blows up an abortion clinic, well, you better be there to support their legal defense fund, because you may have had a hand in them doing this action. So these are the kind of things. And so I think there is a sense where we have to realize that our words don't exist in a vacuum. It's all not theory. And sometimes people are actually going to act on the things you say. So you have to assume that you're in a leadership position and take responsibility for the kind of things. Because if you get somebody financially ruined and thrown out of their job or put in jail, you can't just go like, oops, maybe I was a little bit hasty in what I said there, because that just doesn't really cut it. And far too many guys, and Black Horse was right in calling people out, that there's far too many on the right who are willing to say things that are outrageous and without really thinking through the implications of what they're saying, and then willing to walk away once they've hung young guys out to dry in response to that. And it was specifically during COVID, there was a number of incidents, but these are the kind of things that, especially as the pressure, say in the wake of the Charlie Kirk assassination, where people were really, really hot on the collar, they were calling for blood. It would have been very easy to kind of agitprop a bunch of guys into doing something very intemperate, in the sense sort of with the lust for blood under their, fresh in their noses, to go out and do something intemperate in response, rather than, calling the regime to basically live up to its obligations to its people, which is a very different sort of thing, right? So I think that's another layer and piece to it in terms of when we talk about the state of the discourse, is I think, unfortunately, there are too few guys who can speak boldly, clearly, and yet at the same time responsibly. And there's a lot of guys who can shitpost and say edgy things, but as you say, like, saying new, novel, and edgy things only carries you so far. At a certain point in time, you have to say something of substance and say it in a manner that's responsible.
No, certainly. I think that in addition to your point about responsibility, this is something you saw certainly with Jan 6, that a lot of those guys got left out to dry during the trucker protest. A lot of those guys got left out to dry.
Yes, they did.
And to me, like, that was a massive failure of leadership. Look, leadership is transactional. Patronage is transactional. The way that humans traditionally, achieve loyalty is to basically say, like, hey, I'll do this for you, and in return, you get this. So for instance, right, you could say, well, isn't that kind of gross and overly, like, economic? I mean, yeah, in the most, like, literal sense of I give you money so you vote for me. But I mean, look at Alexander. Alexander's man loved him because he led them to victory, right? He was successful. They appreciated it. Too. That was it. Yes, that is true. Fair enough. But what I'm saying is that, like, there is a reciprocal nature there. And when someone has put themselves in danger, when they have sort of become a casualty of, their general's campaign, so to speak, in political sense, and they are left out to dry, they are abandoned. Well, you were sawing the limb that you're sitting on as a leader. You're kind of undercutting your ability to reward your followers. But Kryptos, I'm sorry, we're sort of fast coming up on my out.
Yeah, no, and I was looking at the clock and realizing that too. Yeah, like a lot of these things, you and I can talk for eons, and we have in the past. It's just when you're recording, I actually have real world work to do, which is actually up on my second screen right now. But it's it's one of those things. So, anyways, Jay, if people don't know, because it's been a year since you've been on this show, 11 months, crazy. where can they find you? What do you do now? Now that people aren't going to see your face today because I don't post face, but you're now like a face fag, as they say, right? And you're out there with your face on the camera generally. But where do people find you?
Yeah, sure. So my primary output. Can you hear me? Am I lagging?
Yep. No, you're good.
Darn it. I am lagging. Whatever. We'll edit it out in post. So my primary output is the Jay Burden Show. You can find me on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. I do exist on Substack. I write essays relatively infrequently, but primarily use it as my premium feed. So if you want to throw me a few bucks, you'll get the episodes early and ad-free, which you can do on Substack, Gumroad, Patreon. But look, if you don't want to pay me any money, all the episodes are out there wherever you want to listen to podcasts. Kryptos, thanks for having me. Sorry, my internet's lagging a little bit, but this was a really fun conversation, man.
Yeah, I'm not experiencing the lag. Yeah, it was a fun conversation. Yeah, I have to remember too, because I have your premium feed. And so I can't boost as much as I used to because I've got things like a week or 2 weeks ahead of everybody else. And like I was yesterday, I was texting you, oh yeah, your Kevin Deanna interview was really good. And I'm like, wait a minute, that one doesn't even hit that one even doesn't come out yet for another week or whatever. And I'm already texting, that was a great episode, And I'm like, wait, I can't text about this because I can't give my feed. Because if I do that, then I'm going to give away everybody the free feed. And that's not good for your business, right? So,
it actually, like if you share it, they will see, not to get too much into my own shilling, but the Substack has a great feature where you can give out basically like a 5 or 10 minute preview. So if you tweet it out, people would get like a little preview, which I know is annoying.
Oh, I see.
Like
okay.
You want to listen to it. But like if
nice.
you were
I remember
subscriber, you'd hear like, I just normally pick like a particularly interesting segment and like, fade in, fade out. And it's like, all right, throw me $5 or wait the 48 hours until you get it for free. I don't know. I feel like it's a fair deal. Like I kind of hate monetizing it, but I don't know. It's my job. I need to eat. And I feel like 24 hours is, I'm sort of punishing high time preference people, which is probably fair.
I did it similar to you, except I did it a little bit more extreme. Because I know that people say that they struggle to always keep up with everybody's stuff, right? So I thought, well, what's a typical time? And I found that 2 weeks works well. So all of my paid subscribers, by the time I get through that 2 week period, I'll bet you like 85% of my paid subscribers have listened to a podcast or read a piece. And then the nice thing is, and I had like a number of people who say to me that we really like your work and we would pay for it even without it. But some people said, hey, we want to get some value. And sort of the balance is now, once I do that, the whole archive can be free, and I can use that to boost my account, to like send out, hey, I wrote an article about this, and I can send it out to everybody. But the paid people still get that 2 week window where they have something that's exclusive and that nobody else is getting it, and they're ahead of the curve and that sort of thing, which is really nice. So I took that, I sort of thought, hey, what Jay's doing is interesting. I think that might be the solution for me to manage my paid versus free sort of thing. So I think you could probably stand to lengthen it out like a week or so would probably be good, I think.
That's fair. There's despite being a professional podcaster, my business model is not particularly streamlined. I'm in the process of
I'm good at talking to people, not running a business.
Yes. It's actually funny. I got a comment basically saying like, geez, man, slow down. And my response was, you wanted a full-time podcaster. You're getting a full-time podcaster, which is like the Protestant work ethic has been applied to talking on the internet too. So,
well, and this is the like, the fall is the worst season for me for listening to political podcasts and podcasts of friends and stuff, because it's college football season, and I have two favorite college football. One is the national, and then the other is my local team. Having studied in the States in my 20s, I got hooked on college football, and so I basically struggle to keep up with my college football content in the fall. And then I'm very selective about the episodes. So I listen to like as much of your stuff as I can, and then a smattering of others. it's just one of those things where there's only so many hours a day that you can actually either like do work, write, and listen to podcasts at the same time. So it's just surprising. Like there's only like 16 or 18 hours of waking daytime to do all of that stuff. And so, yeah, too much content is too much content. And there's a lot of it out there and a lot of good stuff. It's unfortunate you can't listen to it all. Well, anyways, Jay, take care. You got to go. And thank you for, and we'll have to think and send me that stuff, the fishing picture video from your dad. That would be, I'm looking forward to listening to it.
Sure thing, man.
All right.
I'll talk to you later. Thanks.
Yeah, bye-bye.